Hello, good morning, and good afternoon to in-house counsel from all across America. Welcome to In-House Connect. My name is Shai Mahani. I am the CEO and co-founder of In-House Connect, and I'm thrilled to have you here with us today. Thank you for joining, and special thanks to our presenter today, the fantastic Dr. Tracy Brower. For those of you who are here for the first time, let me give you a quick bit of background. In-House Connect started 11 years ago as a New York City-based meetup group for in-house counsel. Every month, In-House Connect would organize free CLE classes, which were hosted by different law firms and which were always followed by cocktail networking receptions. Every 6 months, we would organize fun and festive networking mixers. Over the years, we've helped thousands of in-house counsel connect with peers and outside counsel alike. The group was humming along. Then, of course, COVID hit. We couldn't meet in person, so we went online, and it's been a fantastic, fantastic transition. We've been able to attract a much larger audience of in-house counsel, truly from coast to coast. We've been able to facilitate way more networking and relationship building, and we've been able to feature high caliber speakers like the one we have today for today's event, The Compelling Case for Empathy. Our presenter today is Dr. Tracy Brower. Dr. Brower is a PhD sociologist studying work-life fulfillment and happiness. She is the author of The Secrets to Happiness at Work and Bring Work to Life. She is a principal with Steelcase's Applied Research and Consulting Group and is a contributor to Forbes.com and Fast Company. Her work has been translated into 15 languages. You can find her at tracybrower.com, LinkedIn, and all the other usual social media channels. We are so lucky to have Dr. Brower with us today to teach us this crucial skill of empathy. Now I'll turn things over to Dr. Brower.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me, Shai. I am just so impressed with you, with this group, with all that you've done, and I'm just absolutely thrilled and honored to be with you all. I have worked for many, many, many years in corporate America, more than I prefer to maybe admit, and have worked with in-house counsel a lot during those years because I've been in HR roles and leadership roles, and so have super respect for all that you all do and what you bring to the process and bring to the value of organizations. So really looking forward to our time together and really looking forward to this conversation about empathy. It's so interesting because I think we can so look at it as a soft skill or a fluffy skill, but we know it's incredibly important. I wrote an article with Forbes on empathy in September, and it has hit over 1.2 million views. It's just gone crazy. The average views are usually a few thousand. And so 1.2 million is just kind of bonkers. And I think it speaks to how important this topic is. I think it speaks to how necessary this topic is right now. And so I'm really looking forward to our conversation. We will have opportunities for polls and lots of opportunities for Q&A and chat and all that kind of thing. So really looking forward to your perspectives. And please do look me up. I love your point, Shai, that networking is welcome here. So please look me up on LinkedIn or any other social channel. So this is a moment. This will be the most significant reinvention of work in our experience. I think this is so interesting because we have a new consciousness about where we work, what we do, why we work, with whom we work. And that is causing a huge rethink and reset. And what's happening from an empathy point of view is that organizations are feeling more responsibility for empathy, leaders are feeling more responsibility for empathy, and we're looking at people more holistically as we think about well-being, given where we are and all the challenges that we have faced. Here's something else that's brilliantly interesting to me. I heard a economist speaking, and she was talking about how there has been a fundamental severing of connections to people's job, their company, and their region. And this is really different. In previous economic downturns, you know how we had the huge downturn at the beginning of the coronavirus pandemic. In previous downturns, people hang on more tightly to their current job. They hang on tightly to their company. They tend to stay put wherever they live. because they're worried about losing a job, they tend to hang on more tightly. The opposite has happened through this economic downturn and the resurgence that's occurred, where people have had this super reset, the super reflect, the super reimagination of what they do, why they do it, and with whom and for whom they want to work. And so that makes empathy more important. Partly it's more important because of all that we're all going through. And it's also more important as we think about attraction, retention, engagement, development for ourselves and our potential new opportunities within our organizations or within other organizations. And as we think about our roles affecting company culture, our roles, no matter what role we have specifically in influencing how we work, where we work, and the people around us. So one of the things that's important to know is that there has been a really significant deterioration of mental health. I follow so much research, and every single week there is a new study about a deteriorating element of mental health. I'm literally not exaggerating. This is a weekly occurrence across the globe. So mental health is declining. People are reporting higher levels of stress and anxiety and depression. Cognitively, they're saying, I can't remember what day it is. They have temporal disintegration. I can't concentrate. I can't get things done the same way. I'm having trouble juggling all the things I used to juggle. The other thing that's interesting is when we have levels of incivility or stress at work, that tends to spill over into our personal lives. We tend to struggle with sleep. People report, I don't feel like I'm such a good parent. So that spillover effect is very significant. And within the work environment, when people experience a degradation of their well-being, it tends to impact on their performance, on the level to which they're willing to collaborate, on customers' responses, because we're all mirroring to customers all the time. One way or the other, we're all in the value chain toward the customer in a good way. And it affects turnover. So this idea of well-being, where we're at and where we're struggling as a society globally, is a very big deal for us as we think about our own roles within organizations, our influence on others, and as we think about how our jobs are impacted. So here's a question for you. We want to get into some polling here. So I'm going to launch the poll. Go ahead and answer whenever you're ready. The question is, to what extent has your well-being been compromised over the last year and a half or so? A, significantly, the struggle is real. B, somewhat, it hasn't been easy, but I've been hanging in there. C, not so much, it hasn't been that bad for me. Or D, the jury's still out. I'll let you know in another couple months. This one is so interesting, I think. I've been asking this question for literally a couple of years now. And there is definitely this ebb and flow. And I absolutely believe and know from research that the ebb and flow itself is challenging. Like if times are really tough, that can cause deterioration of mental health, stress, anxiety, depression. But also this back and forth, this up and down, this uncertainty, this unpredictability has a huge bearing on our sense of well-being. We're climbing the mountain, we're slogging through, and we think we're getting to the peak of the mountain, and we realize, oh my gosh, it isn't the peak at all. The peak is still in the clouds. That by itself can be incredibly challenging for us. So this ebb and flow, this not knowing what to count on, it's really interesting because a lot of companies have said, we're going to come back at this time. Oh, no, that's not real anymore. We're going to come back at this time. Oh, no, things have changed. We're going to change our date. And one of the things that people say is they get frustrated with their companies because of that. But we know there's a broader context driving it, and all the companies are trying to kind of do the right thing and react in the right way. So a new trend has been companies who are saying, you know what, we're not even going to set a date. We're just going to leave it open. So here's our response to the poll. Super interesting. If you turn this on its side, it's like a perfect normal distribution. 20% of you are saying significantly, 20% of you, exactly 20%, saying not so much. And then 57% of you in the middle. Wow, that's like that's like statistically amazing, right? That we are so perfect in our distribution. I think this is really important because where we are personally makes a difference in how we can show up for other people. I just did an article for Forbes about how your coworkers are judging you, and there's some new research on what they're judging. And, we invite people into our homes and they're potentially critical, even if they don't mean to be too critical. And I think one of the things that's important about that is if we are struggling, we aren't necessarily able to show up for each other in the same ways. And so it's really smart to kind of know where you're at, know when you're ebbing and when you're flowing, so that we can try to be our best for each other and really help others when we are feeling up, and be sure to ask for help if we're feeling down. So the other thing that is important about this topic on empathy is that we are in the middle of a talent revolution. Duh, like you don't need me to tell you that. But one of the things that's interesting is 40% of people are saying they are going to leave their current employer. 43% of senior leaders in companies are saying they're going to increase headcount, not just they need to find people to keep their headcount neutral, but they're going to increase headcount. At the same time, 60% of people who are looking for jobs are saying they've been ghosted. So there's this really interesting mismatch in the market. And I think what's happening is that finding the right person, as you know, for a role, finding the right role, if you're the person looking, is like a needle in a haystack. And I think the haystack has gotten bigger as more people are in the market, which makes it really tricky. And so this remoting is absolutely part of the equation. 29% of people say if they have to work in the office every day going forward, they will leave their current employer. Empathy is important to this discussion because when people feel like they have more empathy, they're more likely to stay with an employer. When they perceive empathy in the selection process, they're more likely to join. And when we are remote and distant, it's that much more important that we are empathetic toward each other and that we're able to connect. And those are different skills. One of the shifts that I'm seeing is that we need to go from caring to empathy. Another shift is that we need to go from building rapport to really building deeper relationships. And so this idea of like, how do you connect? How do you build rapport? How do you build relationships? How do you feel connected to others and have them feel like you are accessible to them when we are at a distance? And there's this funky paradox, right? Like we're increasingly distant from each other. And we have a new level of intimacy. Like you see me in my baseball cap after I'm back from my run, or you hear my pet in the background, or you see kind of where I work. That is a new level of intimacy that can drive judgment, and criticism potentially, but it can also drive more empathy. So super interesting, those cues that we pay attention to as humans. So why does this matter? Empathy is not so soft as what we think. When people are happier in their role, when they feel like they're thriving, they will have better physical health. That reduces healthcare costs for companies. When we are happier and feeling like we're thriving, we tend to set bigger goals. We tend to reach those goals. We tend to be more focused on learning. When we are happier and thriving, we tend to make better decisions. In particular, we tend to make better decisions about financial health and financial decision-making. Super interesting. When we are happy and thriving, we perform better. We tend to be more likable. And that tends to add to an organization's positive culture. And there's that spillover effect. Here's something that's super interesting. If we're happier at work, we tend to feel happier in our home life. That isn't necessarily news to you. But here's something else. When we're happier outside of work, we tend to perceive that we're happier inside of work. So I think that's a cool element of kind of empowerment, right? Like maybe things aren't perfect at work, but if you go do things that matter to you outside of work, you volunteer at your kid's school or a neighbor kid's school, you participate in Habitat for Humanity, you participate with your United Way, you do the food drive or the scarf and glove drive if you're in a winter climate. Those things that cause you to feel like you're making a great contribution to your community outside of work will help you perceive more happiness inside of work. The other thing is that this operates at a country level. When countries, citizens are happier and thriving, they have greater GDP, greater educational attainment, and they tend to have better physical health as a nation. So really cool how this really actually matters. So here is another question for you. Let me launch this poll for us. You can go ahead and answer whenever you're ready. To what extent does your organization value empathy? A, totally, we have a culture of empathy for sure. B, somewhat, although they don't emphasize it. C, not so much. Empathy is perceived as more soft around here. Or D, I'm going to plead the fifth on this one. This is a funny group to say I'm going to plead the fifth because you all have a way better understanding of what that actually means than the average citizen. So this one's interesting, right? Because I think there are a lot of organizations that have been really hard hitting and really oriented toward numbers and results. And, let's not focus on that soft stuff. And one of the trends is that because of mental deterioration, because of high levels of turnover and attrition, companies have had to say, oh, maybe we do have to worry about this piece. So I think that's super interesting. The other thing to pay attention to is just the extent to which empathy can drive those organizational results. So I think we're in this moment where the business leaders who understood it understand it even more. And the business leaders for whom it may not have been on their radar screen, or the business contributors, even if they're not in a formal leadership role, are starting to realize that this may be something they need to pay attention to. So 26% of you say A, totally. Look, we've got another normal distribution if we turn this on its side. 18% of you are on the other end of the distribution with not so much, and 52% of you are saying somewhat. 4% of you are going to plead the fifth, so super appreciate that and respect that. I think this is important to us because each of us have such a role to play in shaping our organizational culture. Sociologically speaking, the number one way that people learn is through watching other people, listening to other people, experiencing other people. So the way that we handle ourselves, the way that we demonstrate empathy has everything to do with how our organization will shape its culture, has everything to do with us impacting our organization's culture. Sometimes I think when we have a conversation about culture, it can be like, oh, that's that big thing over there that I'm a part of. But we absolutely have a lot to do with shaping that organization's culture. So I love this. If you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. We all want to go far. We're all in the midst of this challenge together. So here's how we use empathy to do that. So one of the things that's important to know is that we are absolutely hardwired toward connecting and toward empathy. When we have rewarding personal experiences, we get a hit of oxytocin, which is that brain chemical that helps us feel happy. Oxytocin also tamps down adrenocorticotropin and cortisol, which are our stress chemicals, our I'm going to run away from the saber-toothed tiger chemicals. So oxytocin helps us feel happy and it helps us feel less stressed. And we get that hit when we are together. This is not about everybody has to be an extrovert, though. We have different needs for different numbers of relationships and depth of relationship on the introversion, extroversion scale. But we all need some level of connectedness, even if we're on the introverted side of that continuum. When we are disconnected from people, we have higher levels of morbidity and mortality. And the other thing that's really interesting is that we have in our brains what are called mirror neurons. We tend to have a similar experience with others when we see what they're going through. And that is true, especially if we are close to people. There was this really interesting study where they had people see others who were in pain or discomfort. They were the people who were part of the experiment, who were putting on the experiment. So they weren't literally going through pain, but they were acting the part. And when people felt like they knew those others better, they experienced more pain than if they were strangers. They shared the pain either way, But when they had gotten to know that person ahead of time, they experienced that pain even more. This is super interesting too. There was a recent study that was actually highlighted on 60 Minutes. It was about people who are heroes, the people who literally run into the burning building to save others, who literally run into the crashing waves to save people who are drowning. Those people actually have a greater size of their amygdala. Your amygdala is kind of your fight or flight part of your brain. When you experience empathy, that is part of your cognitive bias toward others, part of your hardwiring as a human being, and you're more likely to reach out and help other people. And in some cases, that's the extreme of running into the burning building. The other thing I'll say, finally, is that children as young as 2 experience empathy, and they will choose to interact with those they perceive to be more empathetic. So this is a great experiment. They have children who are really young watch a puppet show, and one of the puppets is empathetic and the other puppet is kind of snarky, not so much empathetic. And then they ask the child who they'd like to interact with later, and they always choose, majority of the time, they choose the empathetic puppet. Even at a really young age, we as humans choose to be with those who we perceive to be more tuned in, more gracious, and more understanding and humane in how we treat others. So, how do we do this together? The best way to predict the future is to create it. I love this. So first of all, a word on words. I think this is interesting, right? Like, what's the difference between sympathy and empathy and compassion? We know that sympathy is kind of, you're not really feeling the thing, but you may be seeing somebody else going through something. Sometimes sympathy is associated with pity, or it's often associated with a distancing. Empathy is very much about putting ourselves in somebody else's shoes, feeling what they're feeling, and really a closeness, a proximity about sharing that emotional experience as much as possible. And then some people say, oh, well, it's not really about empathy. It's really about compassion. That's like the next stage. And you can argue the words. I think what's actually more important than our lingo is probably how we think about demonstrating empathy. Compassion is when we're acting, when we're taking action on that empathy. And so I think what we want to do is pay attention, tune in, ask questions, listen, and then do what we can to contribute toward communities, contribute toward those relationships that matter so much to us. So that's a word on words. In our Q&A, you can weigh in and tell me what you really think about those words and how much you think the difference matters. So let's talk about, there's some brilliant research on how empathy matters. And I want to unpack that and talk about why empathy matters for these reasons. So when people said that their leader was empathetic, 61% of them said, hey, I can be more innovative, compared to only 13% who said, hey, I can be innovative if I don't have an empathetic leader. So empathy made a really big difference in people feeling like they could or could not be innovative. I think the reason for this has lots to do with psychological safety. Innovation is about risk-taking, going out on a limb, feeling like we can say, hey, what if we did something differently? There's really interesting research that says that all innovation starts in private. And as you think about that, I think that's actually real, right? Like there's stuff going on. There's something happening in your organization, or something happening in the market, or something happening with a customer. And if you're thinking about a new, really, really emergent, disruptive idea, you will frequently pull somebody aside and say, what if we thought about this a little bit differently? What if we don't have this all figured out? What if it's really about this over here instead of the way we're approaching it? A lot of times that is a quiet conversation that you're having. And then when you get support for it, you grow the group to whom you're talking. In addition, if we think about innovation, innovation is partly about brainstorming, and then it's also about focusing. It's partly about divergent thinking. What are all the possibilities? It's also about convergent thinking, making choices and selections about what we think is the best option. And in all of those cases, psychological safety is a really important part of it. I want to know that I can trust the people around me in a one-on-one or a small group, or as the group gets bigger. Because if I'm going to put a new idea out there, I've got to know that I can trust. And so empathy is fundamental to this idea of building trusting relationships. I want to know that somebody understands where I'm coming from. That's part of trust. I want to be able to kind of take a step and say some crazy thing and know that someone will have my back. The other thing to think about is some of you may be familiar with design thinking. Design thinking is fundamental to the process of empathy, right? Like really understanding the user, really thinking of new solutions, trying those out, testing those, learning, continuously improving. And empathy is at the heart of that experience, the empathy for the user, really understanding what somebody's going through as an end user so we can innovate. And this is true of every job, right? Even if we're in an accounting job, or I know in a legal profession, you wouldn't necessarily be rewarded for being too crazy or innovative, but there are always new ways to think about solving problems. And I think that's where this comes in. There's additional research that says that when people are in a more empathetic situation, they tend to cooperate better. And I think that goes to show, right? Like this is partly about the way that we think about each other. And if we can put ourselves in others' positions, we can cooperate with them better. And when others are better at that in our culture, that drives more cooperation between us all. So pretty cool to think about. One of the outcomes of empathy is more innovation in an organization. So here's another poll question for you. I will launch it as you are starting to consider it here. How important is innovation to your business? So I've made a case that it's important everywhere, but you will tell me the truth and what you really think. A, hugely. Isn't this true for all businesses? B, a medium amount. We focus on performance and execution as well. C, minimally. We're more about the here and now and less about new ways of doing things. Or D, wait, I thought this session was about empathy. So super interested in your perspectives on this one. I think the reason that it's important to talk about some of these business outcomes is number one, empathy is absolutely tied to them. So this is part of the business case for empathy. And then also, it's just important to think about how do we succeed as organizations? And with all the changes that we've been through, innovation ends up being one of those core competencies that's critical. So one of the things we know is if we look at the skills that are in high demand, being able to think differently, being able to innovate, being able to problem solve end up being in very high demand for people who progress through their current organization or people who want to shift to a new organization. So here is some of your feedback. How important is innovation for you? 61% of you say hugely, 22% of you say medium amount, and 14% of you saying no, minimally, and 2% of you saying, wait, hold on a second. So, I think this is super fair because I think we definitely see that there are businesses that have to innovate. They're always coming up with that next new thing. That is their core competence. And we definitely see businesses that are about really executing and figuring out how to make things happen once they've been ideated. So super interesting from your points of view where this is going. So thank you for participating in that. So one of the reasons empathy is so important is innovation. We've talked about how to drive innovation and what those processes are. Let's talk about engagement a minute and kind of take engagement apart. Engagement is also something that's super correlated with empathy. When people experienced more empathy, they were saying that they were more engaged. 76% of them said that they had the high levels of engagement. On the other hand, if they didn't experience empathy, only 32% of them were engaged. I think what's underneath this one has lots to do with reciprocity. So reciprocity is You all know what reciprocity means, but I think the sociological linkages here are super interesting to consider. Sociologically, we are utterly reciprocal in the way that we tend to operate with others. So lots of studies have been done on this one. When someone gives you something, you're much more likely to give back. That operates in companies all the time. When you feel like the value equation serves you, you are much more likely to give discretionary effort. When I feel like I have growth opportunities, when I feel like I'm compensated fairly, when I feel like I have development opportunities, when I feel like I'm getting learning, when I feel like I'm getting a lot of feedback that's really helpful to me, I am more likely to give that extra effort, kind of that extra oomph that puts me from maybe a 4 on a performance metric to a 5 on a performance metric out of 5. So reciprocity operates within companies, and that's what makes it important to pay attention to things like well-being and engagement, is because we will give more when we get more. This actually operates in all kinds of ways. So there was a cool study where waiters and waitresses, when they give you like a little mint, we have a restaurant around here, and they give you a pixie stick. Is anybody old enough to remember pixie sticks? They're those funny little cylindrical container, like papery containers with powdered sugar in them. I'm sure they're like the worst possible in terms of health and well-being physically, but still pretty yummy. When you get something from a waiter or waitress, you're more likely to leave a bigger tip, and you're actually also more likely to make a positive comment. When you are in a mall, remember when we used to go to malls in the olden days, and somebody would hand you a clipboard and ask you for feedback on something? If they give you $1, you're significantly more likely to give feedback on that thing. Reciprocity is something that we know absolutely operates in the human system. And the reason that it operates is that we are all fundamentally social, and we want to make a difference. We want to contribute, and we want to feel like we're getting back from the community. The other really interesting studies on this have been done around the best way to negotiate. And I would love your perspectives, because I know in-house counsel often is asked for recommendations on negotiation and how hard to push and where to back off and things like that. But in a negotiation, the best, and this has been studied lots and lots and lots, the best way to get the best results is to take a matching approach. One approach is to always give more than what the other person is offering in a negotiation. The opposite approach is always to give slightly less than the other person is giving in a negotiation. But the best results and the best results tend to come when you take a matching approach. So you make an opening bid, and then somebody else comes back to you with their recommendation. And then when you match, that tends to be most effective. That is based on the operating principle of reciprocity that we humans tend to engage. So super interesting. Again, I'd love your perspectives on that when we get to Q&A. Here's something else that operates as it relates to empathy. When people were experiencing more empathy, they tended to be more likely to stay at their current companies. 57% of white women, 62% of African-American women reported this. And they tended to feel more levels of inclusivity. And I have my numbers backward there. 30% reported greater inclusivity. I don't have my numbers back wrong. That is white and African-American. 14% of white and 30% of African-American respondents said they felt like the environment was more inclusive. This is also true in terms of inclusivity and retention, in terms of 50% compared to 17%. I think if we take this apart, what we find is that this is about understanding and respect. Like, when we feel like somebody's putting themselves in our shoes, when we feel like somebody really knows what we're going through, that tends to feel respectful. Like, you respected me enough to pay attention to what I was going through. You respected me enough to put yourself in my shoes. And we all need two things. We all want to feel like we are unique and special and there's nobody else like us. We want to feel that from our colleagues. We want to feel that from our leaders. We want to feel that from our team members. And the opposite, we want to feel like we're pretty much keeping up with the Joneses, like we have an experience that's kind of mutual, like we're climbing the same learning curve and we're in it together. I did an article not too long ago about people who might need a vacation from their kids and how that's hard to admit. But as much as we love parenting or love being part of a world of a child, regardless of that role, it can also be really exhausting. That can be hard to admit. And some of the feedback that came back is, yes, I totally agree with this. And you know what? A really big part of going to work is feeling like I have colleagues who understand, feeling like I have colleagues who are going through it too, feeling like we can grab a cup of coffee and roll our eyes together about things that we might be going through. So we want to feel unique. Oh, there's nobody like you. There's nobody like me. We are brilliant in our uniqueness, and we want to feel like we're absolutely going through it together. So I think those are pretty cool as we think about the effects of empathy. Here's something else about empathy. Empathy is connected with work life. When people experienced empathy, they tended to feel like they could navigate their work life more successfully. And this was I think this is partly about time. Like when we feel like people respect and understand us, we feel like we can spend our time in a way that serves us and we can be more transparent about it. Like my boss gets that I need to take my mom to the doctor. My boss gets that my mom is going through some things. And you know what? That makes it okay for me to be away for a couple hours on Monday morning to go to that doctor appointment. Or my boss gets that I, love soccer and I coach soccer with my child. And that makes it a lot easier to get away on a Thursday afternoon and then turn back on later in the evening if that works in my work life. So this is partly about time and permission, not just formal policy permission, but kind of the really appropriate organic choices that we get to make. And it's also about mindset and transparency. Like one of the things that we know is cultures where we share more openly and more explicitly tend to be more constructive and productive. So if I can miss the meeting and say, you know what, I got to take my kid to the dentist this afternoon, or our childcare shut down again because of Omicron. That transparency is really helpful rather than having to say, I just have to miss the meeting because of something else, or not being able to talk about why you're missing the meeting. That ability to be open, to be fully you, has everything to do with mental well-being, emotional well-being, and it has everything to do with a sense of empathy. Like somebody understands what I'm going through and they've been through it too, potentially. And we already talked about that spillover. When we're happier at work, when we feel like we've got more space at work to be who we are fully, we can feel happier in our home life as well. And the thing I want to say here too is that work is part of a full life. We tend to make work a negative, like, the best part of work is paid time off or weekends, right? The best part of my work is when I'm not working. But in reality, work is part of a great experience. Like it's not always great. You'll have ebbs and flows. There will be things you don't love about your job, but work is a way that we express our talents. Work is a place that we make friends. Work is a place that we feel like we matter. And we all have an instinct to matter. So I love this work-life conversation and the connection to empathy. So here is another poll question for you. Super curious from your perspective. To what extent is your organization focusing on improving its culture in terms of DEI, well-being, and the like? A, significantly, it's critical to attraction and retention. B, moderately, we're always interested in improving. C, not so much at this point. Or D, not sure. So this is relevant, right? Because when we are in different places in our lives, different life stages in our lives, different mental or emotional places in our lives, we need more and less support from our organizations, whether that is time off, whether that is flexibility, whether that is, financial services training, whether that is a yoga class that we can take advantage of, whether that is extra benefits, whether that is emergency childcare, all of those things matter in terms of how an organization supports us. And this is empathy in action. I think it's important to think about empathy as individuals, like how do we demonstrate empathy? It's important to think about empathy as teams, like how do teams make space for all the needs of the members? And empathy as organizations is often manifest through benefits, processes, procedures, practices, policies that serve lots of different people in different life stages and different uniquenesses in terms of what they bring. So you said 44% of you significantly, it's critical to attraction and retention. 29% of you say moderately, and 22% of you say not so much, and 4% of you not sure. This is interesting, right? Because there are so many companies that are moving in this direction. I did some research not too long ago on well-being and organizations that pay attention to well-being. And when they do, I think they set themselves up to really do more in terms of attraction, retention, engagement, and development. If your company isn't there, no judgment here on my part, but the trend is that people will pay attention to this when they make decisions to join or stay or leave. And when more companies are paying more attention to this, it just changes the competitive landscape for talent. So super interesting to know where you all are at on that one. So how do we lead? How do we contribute as individual contributors with an empathetic eye? And I worked with a leader who used to say to his team all the time, "You're behaving so loudly, I can hardly hear what you're saying." Isn't that brilliant? It's just beautiful. I literally knew this leader. I think I was in my 20s. God forbid it was that many years ago. And this has so stuck with me. We can talk about empathy. We can talk about great leadership. We can talk about DEI. We can talk about well-being all day long. But how we behave is really demonstration of those values. So how do we demonstrate empathy? Empathy can be either emotional or cognitive. Emotional empathy is when we just really think about, wow, how might somebody be feeling right now? Cognitive empathy, how might somebody be thinking about this right now? So like even in a meeting, right? Like you're in a meeting with someone and they behave in a certain way. I don't know, maybe they're defensive about their presentation or defensive about the data that they're sharing. You can be empathetic and think, what are they thinking? Like, what would draw them to feel like they need to defend their data? What might they be thinking? Or you can say to yourself, what might they be feeling? Were they feeling attacked, or were they feeling unsure? Were they feeling anxious that made them defensive about their data? So two different ways of thinking about empathy. And one of those ways may come more naturally to you than the other. But I think the point here is to be intentional about empathy, like to be in lots of different situations across your day, across your week, and to really be intentional about putting yourself in the place of someone else. I think the other thing here is to be authentic. Like we all so know when we're working with somebody who's checking the boxes, right? Like they are trying to be a really empathetic person, but they aren't necessarily feeling it in their heart. So I think the more we can be authentic about the way that we express empathy, I might express it differently than you, and that's okay. The more important thing is that we're authentic about it. I think the other thing here is that we can feel empathetic, but not necessarily express that. But when we say it out loud, like when we see a colleague and we know they're struggling because, oh my gosh, the bus schedule changed again this week because we didn't have enough drivers to drive the bus. When we can express to someone, hey, I can just imagine how hard that is, or, oh, that is tough. You're going through a lot right now. When we say things out loud that demonstrate empathy, that is more powerful than just feeling empathy. Asking how people feel is the gold standard, right? Like we don't always have time every day, every meeting, every interaction to ask someone, gee, how are you feeling? And that might actually be a little creepy if we did too much of that. But when we are in the right situations to do that, that can make a really big difference. And then when we're listening, right? Like this is such a no duh, but I have to say it out loud. attention is one of the most scarce resources right now. And lots of us do this continual partial attention thing, right? Like we're in the meeting, but we're kind of checking our email in the background, or we're in the meeting and maybe we're texting in the background, or we're thinking about something else. We do that with people all the time, and it's become so much part of our part of the way that we operate. So really paying attention to somebody is such a gift. It's such a unique way to interact, and such a rare and wonderful, important way to interact. You all are probably doing it already perfectly, but it's interesting to pay attention to that. The other thing then is to act. So I pointed to this earlier, but like really offering help, really being part of a community has everything to do with demonstrating empathy. Like a team that can talk about a couple of the members who have a funky bus schedule with their child regularly because of COVID and can adjust the meeting time to start at 8:30 instead of 8. That is acting with compassion. Or, that your coworker's car isn't running. Oh my gosh, like that doesn't happen to us very often. But when it does, it's like, oh, really hard. And you volunteer to pick them up or something like that. Or, a coworker has all these deadlines that they're facing and you offer to take something off of their plate and do this one piece. That kind of action goes a long way toward creating a culture of empathy and creating a culture not that's just good for others, but the kind of culture we all want to be part of as well. So here's another poll question for you all that we will take on. To what extent have your approaches as a leader or a contributor changed in the last couple of years? So we've been talking about, how we're acting and behaving with others, but curious how this has changed for you. A, totally, this has been a significant period of resetting and reflection. B, somewhat. C, not so much. I've stayed pretty consistent over time. Or D, you'd have to ask my colleagues about this one. We can get the true answer from those around you. I think this is so interesting, right? Like sometimes things are so upset around us that we really think about how might we change. And in other times, we may not be motivated to change our behavior so much, even if we've reflected deeply, even if we're feeling a lot around us. So this is very personal and super interesting to know where you all are at. So let's see, let me share these results with you. 44% of you say total reset. I would love to hear how you've reset and what those changes have been. Share that with me on LinkedIn or share it in our Q&A or in our networking. That would be super cool to hear how you've transitioned. 36% somewhat, 10% not so much. You've stayed pretty consistent. Or D, 10% of you are saying, keep me honest. You can ask my colleagues. So love that. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, this one's interesting, right? Like, who do we want to be? How do we want to show up? And how are we both predictable and evolving all the time over time? So how do we lead? And I think leadership is super important to talk about. Each of us individually, no matter what our role, whether we're in a formal leadership role or an individual contributor role, we are leading all the time through example. So how do you lead effectively for empathy? We've talked some already about how you demonstrate empathy. And when you're leading, a really big part of trust is alignment. We tend to not trust people who say one thing and do another. We tend to not trust people if they feel a little, like if we're unsure of their motives, if they feel a little creepy. Creepy is usually a mismatch between what we would expect in a social situation and what's really going on. There is a great example. There was a toxic culture that I was aware of. And there was a leader in this culture who used to, like, some days she'd be your best friend. Hey, how's it going? So glad to see you. Big hugs all around, right? Pre-COVID. And other days she would either ignore you completely or she'd give you a dirty look. She was the most unpredictable leader. And the people in this organization utterly struggled with this person. And that is completely to be expected. If you ask people, whether they would rather have a leader who is unpredictable, and sometimes good and sometimes bad in terms of their leadership, or sometimes less good in terms of leadership. And you ask them alternatively if they'd like a leader who isn't so great, but they are always not so great. People will very, very significantly choose the leader that is predictable. We would rather have predictable behavior that is not so good than unpredictable behavior that runs the gamut between great leadership and not so great leadership. Predictability is important for trust. It's important for empathy. It's important for alignment in terms of the say and the do. The other thing that's important about leadership is accountability. Like, I think we're in this really interesting place where so many people are going through so many hard times that teams and leaders want to give people lots of latitude, which is great. Like, I empathize. You're going through it. I want to give you latitude. I want to give you flexibility. And if we have too much latitude and flexibility, we may not feel valued, right? Like, I want to know that my work matters enough for you to hold me accountable. I want to know that you need me at that meeting. I want to know that you need that output and you're waiting for it from me. So accountability is not a bad thing. Accountability can be very empowering and validating. And that is about empathy, because I want to empathize with all that you're going through and give you latitude and flexibility. And I want to empathize enough to know that I want to validate you and really respect and appreciate your contribution. And we talked about how we are all influencers in our cultures. So how do we really create a situation with empathy? We demonstrate it in all the ways that we talked about, and we lead for empathy in these kinds of ways as well. So how do we move forward? Like, what do we do with this information about empathy? How do we create kind of a new go forward? How do we create a new path? We make empathy a business conversation, right? Like if we're paying attention to this topic, we probably are more swayed toward empathy. And we may or may not be in an organization that also supports empathy as a critical, hard skill. And we can make this about the business in terms of performance, in terms of retention, in terms of collaboration, in terms of cooperation and engagement and innovation. I think the other thing we can do is be really intentional about it. Like, as individuals, we can be intentionally empathetic. We can also drive conversations in teams. Like, how can we be empathetic toward different members' needs? And we can drive it at organizational levels. How might we have systems or processes or policies that support empathy? And I've given you some examples of those. And we can take action. If we know that somebody's struggling or we know that somebody's celebrating, we can take action toward contributing to that experience. So it's amazing how a little tomorrow can make up for a whole lot of yesterday. We have been through a lot of yesterday, and we are so ready to move on to tomorrow. And we know it might be just a little bit longer, and it's more of a marathon at this point than a sprint. But boy, we will get there. This really is a moment for a bright future. So let me do a final question for you all that will take us into our Q&A. To what extent do you feel prepared for the future? A, totally. We don't know everything, but we know enough to move forward. B, somewhat. Figuring it out will be part of the journey. C, not so much. There's a lot of work to do. Or D, if only we had an easy button. Could we just pause for a minute and talk about the easy button campaign? That was one of the most brilliant marketing campaigns, right? When you're talking about it years later, you know it was a brilliant marketing campaign. So here's what you all said. Another perfect normal distribution if we put it on its side. 20% ready to go, 60% somewhat, and 12% of you are saying not so much. And some of you just want that easy button. I'm right there with you. I think this is such a moment for us to think about where we go from here. And we will, some of us be raring to go and we can help others. Others of us may be like, ugh, what's next? I'm not sure. And so we can ask for help from our colleagues as well. In the final analysis, I really do think this is a glass half full moment. This experience of the last 2 years, 2.5 years, has been such an opportunity to reflect and reset and really either reinforce the thoughts we had before or think really differently. And either way, we're paving the way toward a break. So thank you, thank you, thank you. I appreciate you all being part of this. I can't wait for the questions that you will ask and the discussion that we will have. So with that, Shai, let me turn it back to you, and we will do some Q&A and talk about where we all go from here together. So thank you, thank you.
Thank you for delivering a fantastic presentation. Thank you to the audience for participating in these polls. We had a really high percentage of participants, so thank you for that. I have some great questions queued up, but if you have questions, please put them in the chat or message me directly, and I will feed them to our speaker. So the first question, are there differences in how empathy can be best shown across different personality types, for instance, introverts or extroverts, backgrounds, across gender, race, or global cultures?
Oh my gosh, this is such a great question. I should have included this. This would be a great next article. I think totally. I think in the same way that you know how they say that the best gifts are best for the person who receives them, not necessarily just the giver, right? But I think empathy is like that too, and recognition is like that. So we want to really deeply understand what's best for people and how we can best demonstrate empathy. We might do that by asking questions. We might do that by demonstrating empathy and picking up cues. Like I just think about the way that we interact with people in every way is based on empathy. Like, for example, if somebody's really introverted and they've done an amazing job, giving them some huge recognition and pulling them up on stage and having everybody applaud is probably not going to feel like a win or a recognition for them in the same way that it might for another personality type. And so I think that at its core, empathy helps us behave in a way that makes sense to the person that we're behaving with in all kinds of interactions. And, like depending on culture and depending on background, empathy might look like asking questions, checking in. For somebody else, it might feel intrusive. For some different personality types, empathy might feel like just really creating space and listening. For another personality type, that might feel awkward. And so I think this is really about tuning in to people as individuals, because our differences are always more pronounced individual to individual because we're all so complex than group to group. And so this idea of just really meeting people where they are and thinking about a sample size of one, whoever you're interacting with, is a really great way to think about empathy. I love that question. Thank you for that.
What are some ways of developing empathy? What are some low-hanging fruit in developing empathy?
Yeah, that's such a good one, right? I think you're going to be surprised when I say this, but I think one is reading. Like really reading fiction helps you to get into the mindset of other people. And it sounds goofy, but there's actually research that helps us be more empathetic. Another is to ask people their story. Like, story is a way that we express our experience that's much more rich than just asking people, hey, what do you think about this? So if you ask people for their stories, that's really a cool way to get to know them and understand more deeply what they've been through. Another way to develop empathy is to join groups of people who have a common interest to you. So like when you're working on a task together, that's one of the best ways that you can bond. So you're rolling up sleeves together at a Habitat for Humanity event, or you've joined a project team and you're working together, rolling up sleeves on something that you really need to figure out for a customer. When we get to know others through working on a task, that's a really important way that we develop familiarity and that we develop empathy. So take initiative to get involved with people on a task is a third way that we can really develop our empathy.
Yeah, that's great. Just got a great question. And it has to do with colleagues who don't have empathy. And I'll read the question. How do we manage empathy up the food chain? I can do all of the things outlined, but if those above me are demonstrating counter behavior, how does one deal with that?
Oh man, this is like, it's one of the hardest questions in business, I think, right? Like we can all do a really good job of managing ourselves, but we can't necessarily control the other people around us. I think a couple of things. One, I think we can't underestimate the power of modeling, quote unquote. Modeling is, we learn through watching other people. We have more influence than we even believe we have. So when we do the right thing, when we make the choice that's a powerful choice, that tends to influence others more than we think. So modeling is a big deal. I think another thing we can do is give feedback to people and just really let them know how their behavior is influencing us and influencing others. I get that's not always possible in a corporation. I get that's not always possible in a hierarchy, but when it is, it's absolutely a gift that we give other people. I think a third thing we can do is talk about business benefits. And, like if we see somebody who's not empathetic, I think we can address that issue and say, hey, well-being seems like it's really important. I've been thinking about this thing about well-being. I've been paying attention to some research. Well-being might be something, or empathy might be something, or thriving might be something that we really want to pay attention to as a business. So I think you can address it too as an issue that maybe isn't personal to somebody. The last thing I would say is I love, as we think about our organizations and our influence, there are two questions I think we need to ask. One, how big is the problem or the issue or the challenge? And two, how much influence do we have on it? If it's a huge systemic issue, right? Like you're in a toxic environment and you have tons of influence, that is a time to buckle down, recommit, and make a difference. On the other hand, it may be a huge issue that you don't feel like you have influence on and you want to make another choice, or a small issue that you can influence, or a small issue that doesn't matter enough to worry about influencing. All of those are possibilities, but I think really thinking about how big is it and how much influence do you have, those are helpful to think about how you address something.
Yeah. I have one more question teed up. So this is a last call for questions, and then we're going to go into a breakout room. Empathy is such a hot button topic. You alluded to it in the beginning of your presentation, and this ties into a question we received. Is it top of mind now because of remote working, because of the pandemic, because of maybe Black Lives Matter and like that whole thing? Is it generational divides? That's what one question was basically alluding to, a generational divide with like millennials and other generations interacting and the difficulties there. Is it just like a whole big perfect storm of an environment for this topic?
Totally. Yes, yes, yes. I think your question is the answer. It is a perfect storm. Here's something that's super interesting. If we look at the research on the flu pandemic of 1918, there was incredible amounts of social unrest, of people who were very polarized, of political divides, of incivility, and those dynamics waned as the pandemic waned. And so the pandemic is not an excuse for all that we're going through, but it does create context for all these other things. And I just think it's really interesting when we look at patterns over time, those can be so insightful as we think about what we're going through. So yes, I think it's a perfect storm of all the things that you mentioned. And when we are all going through so much, it really creates the conditions for polarization, for frustration, for incivility, and therefore, and all of the challenges in our lives also create the conditions for more mental health challenges. And all of that kind of challenge, all of that difficulty, the reaction to that is, oh my gosh, we need to be more empathetic. Oh my gosh, how do we think about connecting with others? Oh my gosh, how do we reconnect in situations where we become so polarized and where we're not treating each other the way that we want to treat each other? So I think that when we're not at our best, it creates this upswell, this recognition that we can be better. And I think that's part of where that empathy conversation comes in. So I love your question. I think it's right on in terms of the research that I'm seeing anyway.
Yeah, awesome.